So the central nervous system. So that includes the brain and spinal cord. So what does the brain need? The brain needs blood flow, blood oxygen, and blood glucose. And to function properly, it needs the proper function of neurons and neurotransmitters. So some things that can impair central nervous system regulation would include reduced perfusion, such as from strokes or traumatic head injuries, which can increase the ICP, and alter neurotransmission, such as like seizure disorders, insufficient glucose, infection, meningitis, degeneration, such as like Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, dementias and stuff, developmental defect, so congenital hydrocephalus, which is like the brain's like huge from the water, and neoplasm, so like benign or malignant brain tumors. So some risk factors would include for older adults would be decreased balance, so this can increase risk for falls, so increased trauma, like head injuries or stuff, and then atherosclerosis, so as we age, like we can get like more fatty plaques in our vessels, and that can reduce the blood flow and everything. And comorbidities like heart failure, or like heart diseases in general, like hypertension, AFib, or respiratory diseases like COPD and everything. And then for the younger people, they're at risk because they're more likely to have like risky behavior because of their undeveloped frontal cortex, and that can increase the risk of injury. And they might have like developmental issues from like early on in like the childhood, and increased risk for STIs. And then so onto the anatomy. So the left hemisphere, that's with like the logic, controls the right side of the body, and language. So that includes like the Broca's and Wernicke's area, which we'll talk about more about later. And then the right hemisphere, so that's involved with the creativity, insight, spatial orientation, and controls the left side of the body. So the brain receives like 50% of the blood supply from cardiac output and 20% of the oxygen from the body. And that's quite a significant amount, And then the neurons, they don't have glycogen storage unlike the other parts of our body, so our body must always have a glucose supply. So in terms of the blood supply to the brain, so we have like the internal carotid arteries and vertebral arteries. So the internal carotid arteries, that is controlling the middle and frontal brain, and then the vertebral arteries is the posterior, cerebellum, and brainstem area, so this area. So the middle cerebral artery, so MCA, that controls the cerebrum. So that involves the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes, and the basal nuclei, which is involved with like movements. And then the anterior cerebral artery, the ACA, that's controlling the cerebrum, the frontal and parietal lobes, and the prefrontal cortex. And then like for the vertebral arteries, that's with the it divides into the basilar artery, and then that further divides into two posterior cerebral arteries, and then that affects the occipital and temporal, like the inferior part of that, the lobes. So with the MCA, the middle cerebral artery, that controls the motor and sensory of the hands, face, and arm. And then it also controls like our language area, so the Broca's and Wernicke's area. So the Broca's area, it's involved with the expression of speech, and that's in the frontal lobe, while the Wernicke, it involves comprehension, and that's in the temporal lobe. So if there's damage to like the lobes to the left MCA, that can damage the Wernicke or Broca's area. And if it's a damage to the Broca's area, then that would lead to expressive aphasia. So that means it's hard for the person to express through speaking and writing, but they can understand what you're saying. While with the receptive aphasia, they're unable to like understand written or spoken language. So like they can speak, but like it's probably like a word salad, And then next, so yeah, the MCA can lead to dysarthria. So that's like when you have a difficulty speaking because the muscles you use to speak are weak. So that's with the Broca's. And then with the anterior cerebral artery, the ACA, so like let's just think about how like they control it oppositely. Like anterior, they control the bottom parts of the feet and the legs. And since the anterior cerebral artery, it involves like the prefrontal cortex, that affects the reasoning, planning, decision making, and problem solving. And then with the posterior cerebral artery, that affects our vision and our learning and memory. So because like it affects like the occipital and inferior temporal area. And then it's called hemianopia when you have like a loss of half of your vision. And finally, we have the basilar and vertebral artery. So that it impacts the balance and coordination, and also our vitals and non-vital reflexes. So like that's like, for example, like they can have ataxia, which is like a balance issue, especially like with stroke people, and like hiccuping and dysphagia and stuff. So the basilar vertebral area, it's like the back area. So the cerebellum that's controlling the balance and coordination, and then the brainstem that's controlling the vitals and involuntary movements and stuff. And that's all.